Hello and welcome to Axumawian Media. My name is Melat Habtu and I'll be hosting Inside Tigray, a show that will give you a Tigrayan perspective on global, continental and statewide affairs. Please tune in, listen, engage and participate for an insightful and constructive discussion. Hello everyone and welcome to Inside Tigray. Today we have a very special guest. Dr. Sela Muyoka Musundi is our guest for today on Inside Tigray. Many of you may know Dr. Muyoka from some of the pieces that she's written. She's been engaged with some of the topics that were being discussed on Tigray. She's written various articles and she's also an expert in the aftermath of, the state of victims after the Rwandan genocide and also the African migration to the Gulf. Dr. Muyoka, I think I would do you a disservice if I introduce you. So I would like to maybe start off with you telling us about some of the work that you've previously done and some of the research that you've been engaged in previously.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here, and I hope you can hear me clearly. I feel very privileged to have this opportunity to engage with you on this platform. Just to be very quick, I want to say that my interests with respect to research on Rwanda specifically focus on the lived experiences of children who were born as a consequence of sexual violence during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi. So my interest is really looking at how these young people have grown up and what experiences they have had within family and community setup. I'm at the same time very interested in the experiences of Kenyan women who are migrating to the Gulf countries for work. This is specifically domestic work that they're doing because it's just very difficult for them to find employment here in Kenya. And very often what we've had is harrowing stories of these women either being killed or returning home in a very dire state after being inhumanely treated in the Gulf countries. And so I am currently just about to begin my research on a new project through the University of Ghana to just with support through the Ford Foundation West Africa to look at the question of the experiences of young Kenyan women migrating to the Gulf countries and what it is that we can do right here back at home in Africa to ensure that our African women who are going to the Gulf countries do not have these bad experiences, that they are actually able to go out there and work if need be and stay safe in those countries. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Dr. Muyoka. So most of the work that you've done centers women and children, as you've stated,
yes.
Which is obviously during any conflict, when any crimes are committed on a mass scale, women and children are probably the where it hits the toughest, where it really has an impact of something that's very difficult to deal with as well, because there's a lot of trauma, especially in children. There's a lot of trauma that carries on to adulthood and that impacts society, and that really configures society in a certain way based on the kind of lived experiences, as you had suggested, some of the studies that you've done. So tell us more about some of the findings that you've kind of came across when doing your research on the impact that the Rwandan genocide had on women and children.
Okay, so thank you very much. So I want to say that very often when we read about the experiences of youth who were born during the genocide in Rwanda, we tend to hear a lot about the social stigma that they have encountered, which is the case, the encountering of social stigma, the mistreatment and neglect from family members, and even sometimes from their own mothers, these sorts of things. And so when I did my research in Rwanda, I want to say it was through the support of the Social Science Research Council in Brooklyn, New York. They have a program called the African peace building network, where they support upcoming early career scholars in Africa who are interested in doing work on conflict on the continent. And that's how I began to do this research, through their support, their generous financial support. And so during my time in Rwanda, this is around 2018, 2019, I was, researching youth who were born as a consequence of sexual violence in the 94 genocide against the Tutsi. And what I found, many of these young people really struggle with their sense of selfhood, obviously, because especially those that have found out who their fathers were, or let's say their parentage, their fathers having been involved in the genocide. Many of them felt disturbed by this discovery of their paternal identities. And many of them were just also struggling. It seemed to me they were struggling psychologically because of just very horrific experiences that they had. Actually, majority of my research participants stated that they were abused as children. So they had really bad childhoods. They were neglected, they were abused, and they just didn't have a very good sense of self-worth. But as they had grown up, they had become mature and older. Some of them had the opportunity to be counseled, to receive some type of talk therapy, and that seemed to have helped. For those who received therapy, it seemed that they benefited a great deal, and they were able to begin to maybe reconfigure their self-worth. But for those who hadn't had any type of psychosocial support, it just seemed they came across as still struggling to make sense of what had happened to them, make sense of who they were as individuals. But one of the things, I don't want to tell a sad story, because there's also positive things that I found from these young people. I found out from my research that these young people were playing a very critical role, one that is often not very talked about in the research, is that they were providing tremendous support to their mothers. Many of their mothers have a lot of chronic issues that they're dealing with, long-term chronic conditions that they're dealing with. They, for example, a lot of the participants mentioned that their mothers were living with HIV. Some of them had mothers who had chronic pain, like back pain, pain in the body, in different parts of the body. Some had mothers who were suffering from disability. And all of these things were related to their experiences of the genocide. Some had mothers who, actually, let me just say all of them had mothers who had mental health issues. Yeah, and they were always in and out of hospital. I remember speaking to one participant who had a mother who just seemed to me was suffering some type of panic anxiety or something like that, because she would wake up in the morning and tell her daughter, like, I think I'm dying, you need to rush over, you need to come and see me, I need to say bye. And when they would try to get to her after some few minutes, it seemed like she would be going back to normal. So, they had these experiences where their mothers were not really okay psychologically. And all of this because of the experiences of the 94 genocide. And I want to just say this to underscore the fact that I think for many of us, especially those of us who haven't lived in war zones, there's an assumption that after so many years, people have moved on and they have recovered. But for me, what I have found is that in many instances, survivors of war tend to live a very long time with the consequence of war, the exposure to violence, witnessing the death of their loved ones, the destruction, all of these things linger on for a lifetime. And so that's the case with the women and children of Rwanda as well. They have had to carry this pain for so many years. And I think that any of us who are out here who are free, we need to really develop some type of empathy for anyone that is living in a war zone or who has lived in a war zone and has now maybe been able to escape. If they're refugees that have now migrated and are living in your communities, I think it's very important to be sensitive to where these individuals may be coming from and not just assume that they are okay. You have quite a number of people who are still carrying the burden of war even after the war is over.
Yeah, absolutely. You touched on mental health issues that was predominantly seen within the victims, within the mothers. Do you think there's a difference, for example, in the victim response, in the way that the society responds to victims, when it's within the African societies in comparison to maybe within Europe of people who have women who have been victims of sexual gender-based violence, and how does that the stigma maybe that may be carried within different societies, how does that impact those children that you conducted the research with on? Sorry.
Okay, so you know what I want to say that you know, there are comparisons where you find similarities and differences. If you look at, for example, the question of what happened in Bosnia, you know, in the Balkans, where because they had a genocide there as well, I think that you can see parallels between Rwanda and Bosnia, because the women in Rwanda and the women in Bosnia had very similar experiences where they reported, you know, having some kind of social stigma directed towards them. You know, the stigma is directed towards women because they have been raped, and that is the irony of it all, is that these women were raped in the wars, and then they were stigmatized by their communities who, in the case of Rwanda, for example, some of these women have been blamed for using sex as a way of escaping the genocide. And so that's where the stigma for some of them was coming from. And it plays out the same way in Bosnia as well. There's a lot of, you know, just negative energy that was being directed towards these women. So you can see these similarities. With respect to how we respond when these conflicts happen. I mean, for me, it was very glaring when we first heard about the war in Ukraine. When the war in Ukraine began, I feel like the response from, you know, maybe the European Union and European countries was very different. It seemed like the reaction was very quick, and there was some type of solidarity and support, tremendous support from not just from European countries, but even from the United States. Unfortunately, this has not really been the case when it comes to Africa. We know that that's what happened during the 94 genocide that led to more than 1 million people being killed. But we have also seen the same situation going on in Tigray, in the northern part of Ethiopia, where, you know, there's been a lot of loss of life, actually. And just a lot of atrocities and massacres being committed there, and yet you don't have the same uproar, you don't have the same reaction from the international community, and even from just even, you know, fellow African countries. There was just a lot of silence. We didn't see the reaction we expected to see, maybe, if I would say that. So I think it raises a lot of questions around how we respond to war, to conflict, to news about instability in Africa vis-a-vis, you know, instability in other parts of the world, and most especially in advanced countries. For example, you've had a lot of coverage of the Ukrainian conflict. The Russia-Ukraine conflict, I feel, has received a lot more center stage coverage in the international media compared to maybe what you see going on in Ethiopia, in the northern part of Ethiopia, in Tigray, and also you know, in the Congo. Because, you know, like even for the case of the DRC, we have not really seen a more engaging conversation or discourse around the conflict there. You don't really get conversation around the nuances, you know, of this conflict. What is going on in the DRC? Who is involved? What are the relational dynamics between countries of the East African community, for instance? You see, that's what we are lacking in the international, and I would say also local coverage in the media. We're not seeing this conversation. We don't see a full picture of what's going on and what questions we need to be raising. And that's why I say perhaps there's a different way in which we cover Africa as compared to, you know, the advanced nations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really important what you said, because I think it also points to the lacking of African societies sometimes to be able to address, to take our own issues as importantly as we should give it the significance that it deserves. For example, a lot of Africans across the globe stood with Ukraine, or were very in touch with and it might be a reflection on the way mass media reports on it, but how come we are not, as Africans, engaged with some of the conflicts that happen within our very own continent? How do
Yeah.
we have autonomy over some of the decisions made, but for example, by the African Union? Why are we not engaged with those? But yet we're engaged with US politics, or EU politics in the European Parliament. So it does sometimes give you a sense of irony in the way that we as Africans, sometimes as African diaspora, but even Africans living within the continent, are more
Yeah.
engaged with a lot of outside of African kind of politics, rather than some of the conflicts and political environments that are actually, should take significance within our, our very own backyard. Okay, so kind of speaking on the Rwandan, the aftermath. I think there was the museum, so the memorial museum that was kind of built in a way to kind of start the process of healing, and in order not to kind of discard the perspective and the stories of victims, but to bring it to the forefront in a way that is able to be educational to the society, which was interesting. And you wrote a piece on that in 2018, which I discussed with you just now. But within that piece, just tell us more about how you feel like that the memorial museum and the interaction and the ability that it's had to kind of bring a lot of the victims, and sometimes those who are not victims but within Rwanda. How did it bring all these different walks of society together, and what was the use of that?
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much for the question. First of all, I want to start by, I don't know if I would say correction. I hesitate very much to call myself an expert on Rwanda. I think that the experts on Rwanda, Rwandans themselves, they know their country, they love their country, they practice Rwandan culture in a very beautiful way, and I have all the respect that one can imagine. I am a student of Kinyarwanda language. I love Rwanda so much. I have taken on learning the local language just to better understand the context and the history there. And I just want to say, I consider myself a student learning about Rwanda. That's how I would like really to be seen. And I always cringe when I hear people talking about an expert from the West, an expert of African contexts. It's something that is make me uncomfortable. I really feel that the people that know context well are the natives, if you will. And so I can just share based on what I have learned in my time of doing field work in Rwanda and engaging with the people of Rwanda. That's how I'm gonna say this. So the Rwandan Genocide Memorial in Kigali, in Gisozi, the place is called Gisozi, it's just really a resting place for, I want to say, 250,000 people that lost their lives in the 94 genocide. And it really is a place of memory, a place where Rwandans and people from all walks of life gather, throughout the year to remember those who lost their lives. And I think it's also a time when somebody goes to the memorial site in Gisozi, I think it's just a time for individuals to contemplate and think about what war can do. Yeah, what conflict can do to a community, just being able to think through the magnitude of what happened in Rwanda, and thinking through how individuals can come together to try and find healing, which is what Rwanda has been trying to do for so long through their own cultural ways of doing this. And I also want to say that for those who don't know, the Genocide Memorial in Kigali is not the only one of its kind. I mean, there's just so many of them all across the country. And I know there's a lot of people out there who will be surprised to hear this. But as we speak today in Rwanda, we still have unearthing of the remains of those who lost their lives in the 94 genocide. There's still people who are being found and being reburied. Even now, 29, close to 29 years later, Rwanda will be having a commemoration of the 29th anniversary of the genocide in maybe less than a month, in a few weeks' time. It's going to be around the 7th of April. And so we have still, people who were killed in the genocide who are being discovered now. Their remains are being found still, many, many years later. And what I do know is that very often these kind of discoveries, while they provide some sense of closure, because maybe loved ones are able to finally find where these people are and to be able to give them a dignified burial, it's still also very traumatizing to individuals and communities. And what I could say about memorial sites in Rwanda is that I think they give Rwandans an opportunity to always remember, not just what happened in their country, but to be able to remember individual loved ones that lost their lives during that period. I want to say I've been to a couple events where a remembrance was being done, even within my community where I lived in Rwanda, in Kigali specifically. I participated in what you call the Walk of Remembrance, where the local population basically will be walking towards a memorial site. And during this time, they are singing and praying and remembering those who lost their loved ones. And they're usually very emotional events, actually. I would not suggest it for anybody. If you don't have the psychological fortitude to bear with that type of grief, I think it would be advisable to not even attend, because I didn't know this, and so I went to attend this and I felt overwhelmed with emotions. But I felt like it was also important for me to be there, because in participating, I was then able to really get an insider look at what really happens when it's called kwibuka, to remember. When what really happens during that time. I wanted to see and experience for myself. And I know that it was quite traumatic just to see the level of trauma, collective trauma, that has impacted the Rwandan population so many, many years later. When I think about my country, Kenya, I'm originally from Kenya, and when I think about Kenyans, I don't even think they can imagine that. They think that since it's been so many years, maybe people have moved on and they're now living normal lives, and they may not really understand the level of impact that this has had on the psychology of the nation of Rwanda. But so for me, being a witness to the Walk of Remembrance and going to the memorial site and being there, I was able to really see firsthand that the psychological impact is still very real on the country. But at the same time, I want to say that Rwandans have done, everything possible to try and heal from this very tremendous loss that they had in 1994. So at the Kigali Memorial, the event we had there in 2018, where the Member of Parliament Andrew Mitchell attended, it was an event called Ubuntu, which is the same as Ubuntu. It was just really about thinking about, as a people, who you are as a people, the essence of being human or being humane to others, being kind and generous and loving, and all of those good virtues. And I think that's the peace education program in Rwanda has emphasized on the idea of social reconciliation and forgiveness. And I think, as you know, Rwanda has outlawed the idea of ethnic identities. So now people don't identify themselves with terms such as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa as they did in the past. And it is encouraged that all citizens just see themselves as Rwandan, and not through these identities. And I think the effort of the Rwandan government in doing this is to just make sure that what happened in Rwanda in the past never happens again, that Rwandan citizens are able to look at each other as brothers and sisters, and they're able to find ways to reconcile despite what happened in 94. So there's a lot of lessons to learn from what happened to Rwanda and the way in which Rwandan citizens have gone about trying to heal, because it's very different. If you look at Rwanda, it's very different from what you see maybe in other countries that have had conflict. I think that Rwandans have done, they've just really, really done a lot to ensure that the animosity of the past does not persist, that they're able to find ways to heal. And I admire the culture of what they call dignified burials, giving these individuals proper burials, culturally appropriate burials, many, many, many years later. Because I don't know how many countries have done this, but I feel like this is a very unique cultural practice in Rwanda, being able to ensure that their loved ones are put to rest, and that there is a place where somebody can go and be able to commune, if you will, to commune with their loved one, to be able to know that this is where this person is resting. And for those who have not been able to find their loved ones,
Yeah, so that thank you for answering that. So speaking on I think you touched on it, the Ubuntu conversation.
Ubuntu,
Ubuntu
yes.
conversations, sorry, the Ubuntu conversations, and you mentioned it, it's such a beautiful kind of even the translation to be human.
Yes.
It's such a beautiful translation, and I think what we lack sometimes is that just understanding, just humility, right? To be human with each other, to actually understand the victim's perspective as a human being, rather than maybe a political stance or whatever stance you may derive your understanding from, your thought process from. And I think that's essentially a very good place to be at. But what work needs to go into the society for the society itself to bring itself to be on that level, to be on a level where it regards victims just purely through humility rather than the stance which they base their belief from. And I think that's the difficulty when it comes to states like Ethiopia, for example, when there's over different 80 different ethnic groups living under one state, where they all derive from a different thought process, a different ethnic group, different culture, different religion. It's very hard to get to that process of eliminating that for, when these kind of atrocities take place, and to just simply show up as a human being. And I think that's what the fine line is. Where do we project humility when these kind of atrocities have taken place? Because without the projection of humility in these kind of instances, then you lose that relationship between these groups. That relationships will, in fact, be even more divided, even more apart than it had initially been when those atrocities took place. So I think the aftermath of these kind of atrocities, the way that the government initiate the society deals with it is very important. Speaking of the MP Andrew Mitchell, who is actually the Development and Africa Minister in the UK. So there was, in the piece that you spoke about, that I spoke about as well, he recognized the need for during the event that you spoke about, the need for these kind of signs of atrocities, the signs of these kind of polarization of different groups to be recognized beforehand, that there was a failure. We've heard that many times, that there was a failure on parts of the institutions that should recognize this first. But the failure to do that has led to so many lives being lost. And then we fast forward to 2022, and very recently, as you mentioned, the genocide that's occurring in Tigray, for example, where many children have died, many women have been victims of sexual gender-based violence. Andrew Mitchell was actually one of the main ministers who we had been engaging with in terms of advocacy, and we had received an assessment. There was an assessment for Ethiopia that was conducted by the Joint Analysis of Conflict and Stability in the UK, and that was prohibited from being released because of sensitivity issues. And you see these recognition of atrocities as they take place in real time would make a massive impact, because that's exactly what, for example, Andrew Mitchell had said within that event, that the recognition, the acknowledgement of what takes place needs to be in real time. Otherwise, you are losing over 1 million people, as Rwanda has done. And I think it's very important that this goes into more tangible action rather than just words, rather than just appearances in events, to
Yeah.
recognize where the West or where the UN institutions or other international institutions had gone wrong, and
Mhm.
not take action 2 years later, 3 years later, after that same appearance, not to correct that process. And I
Yeah.
think that's where a lot of misgivings and a lot of mistrust lies when it comes to the seriousness of these actors, in dealing with atrocities that centers victims, for example. So I think it's very important that we highlight that process. The
Yeah.
process itself needs to be tangible. It should not just be recognition after post atrocity, post genocide, which is very important. So let's speak about your other area of research, as you mentioned, the migration of Africans to the Gulf states, specifically women, as you had said. And where is that research? I know you said it's kind of a new concept for you, and you're still kind of learning more about it. But just tell us
Yeah.
a bit of what you've learned so far, and what the what the what the current situation is in terms of East African women, or the migration from East Africa to the Gulf.
Absolutely. So I want to say that we actually have quite a significant increase of migration of African or East African women to the Gulf countries. And I think you know this, Melad. You have a large population of Ethiopian young women that are going to the Gulf countries, and the same applies to Kenya and Uganda. So these are the three countries which are supplying the Gulf countries with domestic workers, female domestic workers from Africa specifically. And the reason why we have such a huge migration of young women to the Persian Gulf is because, I mean, to be frank with you, there just simply no job opportunities here. I mean, I don't know what the case is in Ethiopia right now, but Kenya right now is just really bad, actually. The unemployment rate is very high, and especially for young people. And I think that a lot of young people are disillusioned just being here, being unemployed, not having anything to do. And you have a situation where majority are opting to go to the Middle East because they feel that at least going to do domestic work in the countries in the Persian Gulf will give them a way out of poverty, which on the outlook, it seems like a very good plan, to get out of poverty, to be able to work and send money home and help parents and family and so forth. And for some, it's been a good thing for them. They've gone out there, they've made a living, they've sent money back home, they've remitted large amounts of money, and their families have been able to really cater for themselves to survive, essentially. But we also have very disturbing reports from the Gulf with respect to our young women, and we don't really understand properly what is happening there. We've had instances where young Kenyan women have come back home in caskets. They died in the Middle East, and there is no clear explanation of what happened. Sometimes we are told that these women um, committed suicide, or they fell off a building and died. And I mean, the circumstances under which these women have died are just unclear. I am unable to get over the story of the death of a young woman that was called Mary Kibwana. Mary Kibwana originally came from the Kenyan coast. So she went to the Middle East some years back. I can't quite remember the year, maybe around 2017, thereabouts. She went out there to try and see if she could take care of her children because she was married, they had young children, and between her and her husband, they decided that she could go abroad to the Persian Gulf and try to see if she could get, some money, work and survive and help the kids. What happened to her was terrible. She ended up in I think a gas explosion accident in the home, and she had like almost 64% of her body that was burned. And this family that was hosting her where she was working, the employer, I mean, really just basically didn't give her any care. And by the time she ended up in hospital, she was very, very ill. And eventually, when she arrived in Kenya, it just took a few days. She didn't even really last long in Kenya before. And she was hospitalized at the Kenyatta National Hospital here in Nairobi. And unfortunately, she never made it. She died. It was a harrowing story. It's actually been documented. I think it's in a documentary by the BBC Africa. And so her story is reflective of what's happening to so many of our young women who are going to the Persian Gulf. I mean, I have seen tons and tons and tons of videos on YouTube because I have to look at these videos so I can know exactly what the experiences of these women are. And some of them are just disturbing to listen to watch experiences of what's happening to them there or what's happened to them there. And there just doesn't seem to be any accountability on the part of the governments in these countries, whether it's in Qatar or in Saudi Arabia or Lebanon or Oman, wherever these instances have happened, we haven't gotten any type of response from these governments that shows that there's concern and there's effort to kind of stop this. Because what is interesting is that you don't hear similar stories of, say, for example, white women working in the Middle East. You don't get to hear them going through these sorts of experiences. It just seems to me that these experiences are, targeted at, women from the South, from the global South. And so if it's a racial issue and an economic issue, our governments all across the continent need to do something about this, because we cannot continue to lose the lives of very young Africans at their most productive age when they really should be doing something for themselves, to empower themselves economically. And we can't just be quiet. For me, in many of these instances, I don't even consider this work. Because if you go into a home and your passport and telephone, mobile phone are confiscated, and you are forced to stay inside a home for a long, prolonged period of time without, any kind of, permission to even just leave and go out there and relax and have leisure, I think that's contravening the UN Charter on Human Rights, frankly. It's a kind of modern day slavery that we have seen. If you look at some of the videos on YouTube and if you listen to the narratives that some of these young women speak of, it is unbelievable. First and foremost, why would someone take your passport? Like, that's just illegal. That's already a sign of human trafficking right there. And you have also these women complain that they work for many months without being paid their dues. And when they begin to ask for their dues, then all hell breaks loose and they start to be mistreated, they start to be beaten up, and all kind of stuff is going on with them. So I think that the African governments and also the AU, I think that it's time we begin to raise questions about the ways young African women are being treated in the Persian Gulf. I think that it's really about time we took action as countries, and even the United Nations, because this should not be condoned. This cannot be allowed to continue. We cannot have modern day slavery going on. We can't have this happening. If these were citizens of European countries or citizens of the United States or any of those advanced countries, I'm pretty sure stern action would be taken. So we need, as much as our countries need to do business with the Middle Eastern countries, I think that we need to sit at the table with these countries and really communicate that our people need to be treated as human beings. We need to be able to have fair and just conversations. For me, the way I see it, I feel that most African countries are prioritizing bilateral relations because of trade, and they are more interested in doing business with these countries. So they don't want to ruffle the feathers by talking about the elephant in the room, which is the human rights abuses of our children. But we really need to have this conversation. We need to have this conversation. And we also, Melody, we need to ask ourselves, why are we letting young children, some of them are even coming from very rural areas. Like, here in Kenya, some of these children that are taking flight out of Kenya to the Middle East, they have never even been to Nairobi. Like, they came to Nairobi the first time on their way to the airport. Why are we doing this? Taking children from maybe a remote area, they have no exposure. They've not had any opportunity where they've gone out there where they know how to travel on their own, and we allow them to embark on a journey to somewhere they don't know where they're going. I have had a story on just the social media platforms as well of a family whose daughter was being mistreated in one of those countries in the Middle East, and they were trying to get her to come back home, and they were pleading with government to help her, to assist her to return. And they said he was not supposed to go to Saudi Arabia. She was made to believe that she was going to Qatar. And so, the inexperience of having never flown before, because if I was on a flight and I arrived in Dubai and the flight that's taking off is going to, Saudi Arabia and not Qatar, I'll be like, dude, I'm on the wrong flight. I will know that I'm not going the right way. But these children are just put on these flights. They've never had international travel experience before. And we need to really ask ourselves why we're doing this, why we're letting 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds take on this very treacherous journey. And then when something finally happens to them out in those countries, we wait until the last minute, until things are really, really bad. And then we take action. For example, an issue that is not being tackled is the mental health of these young people. We've had stories that there's so many of these young women that migrated there that are stuck in those countries that are really just having a mental breakdown, and they're stuck in detention centers, or even they're just in their workplaces, but they're not okay. They're not okay because of the stress and the mistreatment and so forth. And so my position is, instead of having individual countries take on individual action, why not come together as African countries and have sort of like a united front where we agree on the way forward in terms of how we act. Because you see, Rwanda, if I may use Rwanda as an example, Rwanda does not allow any Rwandan to go to the Gulf countries to do domestic work. That's not allowed there. That's their position. But Kenya, Ethiopia, all of these different countries, Uganda, Tanzania, they're all having like different policy on this issue. But what we know is that at the end of the day, the experiences for all these young women is the same. So why can't we, as East African community, why can't we have a single stance? Why can't we have a single policy on this matter? So that we can read from the same script. And the reason why I propose this is because I believe that when we are a group of us, a group of countries, we're stronger than when you're one nation trying to tackle this. Because if we all stood together as Eastern African communities, and this is our position, we will be stronger in those boardrooms with the Gulf states, because we are all speaking from the same position. But if you have, Kenya saying this, and then Tanzania is saying something else, and Rwanda is saying something else, then we don't really have that strength. We don't really have a leveraging power there. Yeah. So I feel that that's how we could go about it. And we also, as Africans, need to learn our history. What is the history between Africa
and the Arabic countries? What's the history between Kenya and Oman? Because we've had a history there that was based on the slave trade. And I'm afraid to say this, but the recruitment process called kafala that is used to recruit young Africans to those countries, it has a history of racism. And so we need to be cognizant of that as we approve of these sorts of business exchange, where we say our young Africans are going to find employment, which we cannot provide here. We also need to be very aware of the racial dynamics that have a history, because they're going into those countries, and in those countries the populations there understand that their African is not at the same level as them in terms of hierarchy, racial hierarchy. They have told themselves that the African is at the bottom. So when you arrive there, no matter who you think you are or how you have been raised, your race determines the ways in which you are perceived and how you're treated. That's the way I feel. So we need to be cognizant of that. We can't pretend. That's the reality. And so we need to think, even as a continent, what can we do to empower our youth so that they don't feel the need to take on this treacherous journey, not just to the Persian Gulf to do domestic work, but you also have our young men who are dying in the seas as they try to get into Libya and cross over into Europe. We've had, just harrowing stories. And this is like every day. If you watch, France 24, CNN International and all that, they're always reporting about these treacherous journeys that our young men and women take in an effort to leave the continent, and they always end up, maybe dead or really just injured or all of that. So as a continent, we need to think, we need to strategize, we need to have honestly a plan of what we can do, because we have a large population, and in another 10, 15 years, our population will be even larger. What are we going to do with all these young people? We must plan. And the plan can't be to allow them to go into countries where they're going to be, in modern day slavery like conditions. This cannot be acceptable. Even our ancestors would never accept this. So and that's the reason why we also need to get the right people on board, because here in Africa you have people being given jobs who don't need to be in those offices, and they make the wrong decisions, or they're not making decisions at all. And so you have our citizens suffering. The story in Africa is just the same wherever you go: Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Burundi, wherever you go. If you sit down and listen to Africans in those countries and elsewhere, we all telling the same story. So it means our experiences are the same. So we need to have a strategy. And one of those strategies includes listening. We have the older generation holding these big portfolios, and they're not listening to the youth. The youth are never in the room. So the youth are not able to speak and say, this is what we think should be done to help us. And so you just have that situation where the people in power, so to speak, sit at the table and make decisions on behalf of our young people without real consultation. And so as a consequence, you see what we now have. And another thing is, for heaven's sake, let's utilize research reports, because you have the World Bank and so many other entities and organizations, the United Nations and a lot of other organizations that have done research, even doing projections of what is going to happen to Africa, for example, in another 10 years, another 15 to 20 years. Are we paying attention to these research reports? Are we utilizing data? Because once we get these research findings and we are able to have an idea in terms of predictions, in another 10 years, the population will be larger. This is what will be happening with our youth. Majority of them will be seeking employment. There will not be employment available. What then can we do with this information? How can we use this information to help us, to inform our action? So this is something that I think would be important for us as African countries to take on, to pay attention to the research and utilize it to benefit the population.
Yes, I mean, I couldn't agree more, especially with that very last point you made about it's the issue of leadership. I think that continues to have us in a spiral of exploitation. And it's because that you said you absolutely got it right. The lack of involvement from the greater society, from the youth in politics and leadership in so many different aspects of our society. Our youth is not, like you said, in the room making decisions. And I think it's very important because this African solutions for African problems, sometimes it gets exploited. So it's used against the West. But when you go to the new scramble of Africa, the Gulf countries, especially in Eastern African countries, we see they're the ones giving military equipment to these countries in order to fuel more conflicts. They're the ones financially aiding governments who are committing atrocities against their people. So the leadership itself is now under constraint over the leadership, with the leadership in these Gulf countries. They are now in some type of shackles, whereas if that's financially, militarily, in so many different aspects. So we cannot ask for them to put human rights at the forefront when they have so many different elements that they haven't even unshackled themselves from. So I think leadership being one of the major problems, and the lack of engagement that the youth who's actually migrating to the Gulf, representation of them in politics and different aspects of society being very important. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think I've taken up so much of your time, Dr. Muyoka. Thank you so much for being with us here today. Thank you for sharing some of the work that you've been doing, some of the research that you've conducted, some of the findings you found, and some of the experiences that you've been through as a student, not an expert. I will stand corrected. We really do appreciate your insight. And I think it's very important that us Africans, especially when we're so close in proximity, for example, where Tigray is and where Ethiopia is and where Kenya is, being within basically the same kind of region, we face a lot of the same issues. And I think it's very important that we continue to keep these discussions going, because we are facing the same battles, and why not, like you said, address them together. So thank you so much for being here today. Hopefully we can have you back at another time where you develop some other research, or where you've conducted other research, or where maybe you've developed your further research on the migration to the Gulf, and that would be a great conversation, I'm sure. Thank you so much, Dr. Muyoka. Thank you for your time. It's much appreciated.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to participate, to really speak with you, Melad, and I look forward to being able to engage with you again. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and have a great evening. Thank you for watching Inside Tigray. We will be back next time with more topics and more guests.